Hello, and thank you for your interest in the PII Vault from Anonymatic and in our plugin for the Domo Workbench. In this video, we're going to show you how to set up and configure the PII Vault plugin for Domo Workbench so that you can take any on-prem data from database or from flat files, load it directly into Domo through the Workbench and the PII Vault plugin, take fully identified data, load it into Domo, completely de-identified, and implementing the specific de-identification rules that you want. Let's talk about the different things we're going to go through today. First of all, we're going to configure the Vault parameters, then we're going to configure the data source, and then the schema. And once we're all done, we're going to test it. Pretty straightforward. So let's get right into it. I've got Domo Workbench here, and I'm going to create a new job. So let's just call this Demo Redaction. And then as far as transport type, I'm going to pick PII Vault database and files. The other PII Vault option is match data, but we're not going to talk about that in this video. Match data is when two different sources of data have independently used the PII Vault to completely de-identify them, loaded that data into Domo, so there's no PII in there, and then match data would allow you to load a linking file, which would take the anonymous IDs, link them together at the individual, so you can combine that data without having any PII. Before you can do that, you actually have to have the de-identified data, and that's what we're going through here. So we pick PII Vault, database, and files, and we're going to do the same for the reader type. You have to pick a data set. I tend to just use Workbench CSV. It sets the icon inside of Domo. You pick whatever you feel is appropriate for your situation. Now, all of the configuration of the PII Vault setup is in the source. Nothing is done here in processing. So let's click source. First thing that pops up is the overall dialog that'll show you the entire job. Now, we haven't set up anything yet, so we have to first configure the vault. When we're done, we can do the rest of it. So I configure the PII Vault. We start off with what kind of job is it? Now I can do masking, which is taking data, the PII values, and replacing them with realistic looking but fake other values. We can do a match job, which we talked about a moment ago, or we can do a redact job. And not sad, but we're going to do a redact job here. So one thing that we need to do, or the first thing we need to do here, is actually define the location of the vault. Now, your IT staff who set this up, or you, if you happen to be using this on Domo desktop, or I'm sorry, Docker desktop, will have an address. The address is for the pass-through container, not the PII Vault. If your organization uses multiple pass-through addresses, but a single vault, then this could easily be any of those pass-through addresses. But it must be a pass-through address. Then you have to provide the account ID and API key. If the account was set up using and received an email in response, then you have an email that looks something like this, and it has an account ID and API key. We'll just go ahead and copy and paste those in here. Now, some organizations with very strict data security requirements don't allow things like the PII Vault to email. So you may not have received an email. They may have just been, the IT person may have just had to export these values. Either way, you need the address, the account ID, and the API key. On every dialog, you have the requirement to validate the information first. And here, we've talked to the pass-through container, and we verified that everything is good. We're ready to go. A couple of other things I want to point out. First off, the encryption key is something that you can use your own key to further encrypt the data. This is basically bring your own key. Important to remember, if you mix and match different keys here, the records that you load with different keys can never talk to each other. So if you're going to use an encryption key, by and large, you're always going to want to use the same encryption key, and you have to use it all the time for every job, including the match jobs. All right, we're going to leave that empty. We don't need to do that. Import and export is I can take my entire PII Vault job configuration and I can save it to a file that I can load it later. So in fact, right now, I could simply export this right now And then next time I have a job, I could just import it and I wouldn't have to fill in all this information again. The API key and any database keys, passwords would be further encrypted, so anyone just opening up that configuration file can't read it. It will export the entire job depending upon how much you put in. I've only put in this first dialog, so that's all it would export. If I had filled out the entire job, it would export the entire job. This is one way that you could actually version your jobs. But anyway, let's go ahead and save those credentials. We're good to go. It's all in here. It's a Redact job. Here's the account we're using. Here's the address. We don't show the password, but we do have it. All right, next thing is configure the data source. There's two different types of sources. We can have a file source. The file can be a CSV file, a TXT file, or a Excel workbook, or it can be a database. A database that we support right now are MySQL, SQL Server, and Teradata. You can also have anything that has an ODBC interface. And so if you check ODBC, you can pull data from any of the system DSNs. All right, let's go ahead and just leave this as file. We're going to go through and we're just going to load some employee data from an HR example, and it's a CSV file. Let's take a look at the data that we're going to be bringing in. Pretty simple stuff. There's an employee number. There's the employee's first name, last name, their email address, gender, salary, and department. You can handle far more complex and certainly much bigger records, but for this illustration, we're just going to do that. Once again, we go ahead and validate. Everything's good. Before I leave, let's talk about the block size. Block size affects the performance of the PII Vault and the anonymization. We found that 1,000 records at a time is a good number. Tends to process very, very quickly. If you have very large records, you may want to lower that number. If you have very small records, you may want to increase it. You can play with changing the sizes and find out which one works best for you and your organization with your data and your infrastructure, whatever hardware you have this all running on. But 1,000 is a good place to start. All right, let's go ahead and save that. Now, last thing we do is we configure the schema. Let's go ahead and open this up. And what it did is it read the file that we supplied. It found the different columns and it went through and it said, oh, let me see if I can figure out what these are, because there's two different things that you really need to do on this dialog to complete the job. The first is for each column, you need to tell the PII Vault plugin what it is. In this case, we said that the employee ID is the unique key to the individual. Now, if that's not right, there's lots of other choices we can set it to. Basically, there are different types of PII and there's non-PII. Non-PII is basically anything else, anything that doesn't identify that person in one way or another. But the employee ID is the unique key to the individual. There must be one and only one unique key to the individual on every record. That's how we keep everything together for that person. So we've correctly identified that the first name is their first name, last name, email, address, gender, salary, and department. We're just going to leave alone. The Vault does not even look at these things. Now, the last thing, and this gets to be the most fun, is what action are we going to perform? So there's a lot of choices. We can do nothing. And for the non-PII, typically you want to do nothing. Or you can partially redact the data in a lot of different ways, depending upon the kind of data that it is. So unique key to the individual, we're actually going to fully redact that data. The first thing, we might want to fully redact that as well, but just to show you some examples, we're going to let the first two letters of the last name show and the first letter of the, first two of the first name, first one letter of the last name. We're going to go ahead and fully redact the email. We'll leave the gender there and we'll leave salary and department. That's it. Now, the last column that I didn't talk about yet, column type group. Column types, I've got first name, I've got last name, I've got email address. Now, what if this person had two email addresses? Or even more confusing, they had both a home and a work address. Now, you know, an address, you typically have a street address, a city, a state, and a zip, right? And here, if those were there, I've got all those different values for an address. Now, if I had two street addresses, two cities, two states, two zips, how would the vault know which ones go together? Well, that's what this does. You would take the value, all the values for this home address, and you would put it together with a value of 10, and all the values for the work address and put it together with a 20, or however you want to assign them. But that's what this value does for you. Okay, let's go ahead and validate. Everything is good. Valid schema is valid. We're going to go ahead and save that. We can see the entire job here. That's all looks good. Let's go ahead and save that. And now we'll preview it. When the preview comes up, you're going to see that the data that we had brought in before, which had the employee ID, first name, last name, Abby Wormold was the first one, her email address, gender, salary, and department. What we now have is there's no employee ID. We had our fun with the partial redactions of the name. The email address is gone, gender, salary are there, as is department. Now, the other thing that has been added is we now have a value that uniquely identifies each person. The same value will be applied to the same person who's loaded from the same account using the same unique key. So all the data that we now load for Abby will always have this one value. So in Domo, we can immediately link all that information together. All right, that's it. I hope you enjoyed it, found it nice and easy to do. If you ever have any questions or issues, please reach out to your Domo support or to an automatic. We'll be happy to help you. All right, thank you very much.